Hey YouTube, how is it going? I hope all is well. Today in episode 3, we're gonna learn how I'm gonna call it a universal gain stage works. This is basically a common cathode stage. It's the most common stage in any amplifier. Pretty much 99.99% of amplifiers are gonna have this in it. Let's do a quick little brief from everything that we've already done in episodes 1 and 2. In episode 1, we went over the different options that there are for capacitors and resistors. And the object there was to get you to just pick one. You just have to pick one. It doesn't matter which one, just pick one. Episode 2, we kind of talked about what the function of a resistor was, the pros and cons of each of the different ones, and then, of course, the capacitors and kind of the pros and cons of each one. Again, just kind of lining out how they operate. We learned the difference between polarized and unpolarized and how they function, what they do. So in this episode here, we're going to kind of tie that all together. This one's very similar. This episode's going to be similar to another video I've already kind of done about building amplifiers, but we're going to kind of tie this one in a little bit more. We're going to get more into the nitty-gritty about what each of these parts does so you can understand how to modify or, build an amplifier with this basic, backbone, if you will. I am not going to get into math. I'm not going to get into load lines. You're going to know just what targets or ranges you have to work within, okay? I'm going to try to get this into about a half an hour. So we're 2 minutes in now. Let's move it on. All right, what are we looking at here? This is a typical gain stage that exists in literally about 99% of amps out there, if not higher. Think Fender, Marshall, Vox, you name it. This is what they got going on right here. We are looking at the input version of it. So this isn't like a intermediate gain stage. This is literally the very first stage in the amplifier. With the knowledge that you have of this stage here, you can do anything you need to do to any preceding stages afterwards because they all work exactly the same. All right, so let's start at the input. You must have a grid leak or grid reference to ground. That's what this grid leak is. It ranges anywhere from 1 meg down to 100K or so. It generally doesn't go any lower than that. Now, what you need to know is that this is what presents the load to the preceding stage. So to the guitar, it sees the load going into this preamp tube as being 1 meg. Okay? So you've probably maybe read up on DI boxes a little bit or something like that, and they've talked about how that it has an impedance or whatever, right? Generally, we're shooting for an input impedance of something like 250K to 1 meg or something like that. 1 meg is a great impedance to have for a guitar to work against. This is the load that the guitar will see, and it also sets the standard for this stage. Another way that you can think of this guy here is as a volume control. In the case of a tube, though, it's static. So 1 meg is pretty much the highest value that you can go. That is basically all the gain. That's all the beans, right? That gives this thing full amplification factor, right? That's kind of how you can think of it with 1 meg. You can go up higher, but you're on a slippery slope. You can get into instability real quick. So I would say stick it to 1 meg or lower. However, you can go lower. If you need a little less gain coming out of this stage, going into the next, or however you want to put it, you can go lower. I wouldn't go much lower than about 220K. When you start getting down to 100K, it starts loading everything down too much. It gets way too quiet, and you're not really doing it. You basically nullify the purpose of having that stage altogether, right? So that one there, somewhere between 220K and 1 meg. On the input side of the amplifier, it's almost always going to be 1 meg though. In preceding stages or stages, down the line, you can play with that number a bit. Grid stopper, that's this guy right here. This is the grid, notified by grid. The grid stopper's job on the input side of the amplifier is to stop RF, or to keep RF, radio frequencies, from modulating themselves in the tube and being amplified out of it. Now, there is a limit that you can go with on that. If you go too low, right? So 68K is a good number. That's a good starting point. 33K is really all you need. And then 10K might be the lowest you can possibly get away with. So somewhere in there, I'm talking again just on the input side. We're not talking about intermediate stages at this point. 68K is going to be a little bit darker, right? Whereas 33K is going to sound pretty much normal. It's right up the middle. And then 10K, if you use 10K, will be a little bit brighter, but you could be on the verge of allowing RF, or radio frequencies, to get modulated inside of that tube stage and then amplified out of the amplifier. Not saying it will, it's just a potential possibility. So 33K, I would say, is the magic number there on a typical input stage. You'll notice on Fenders and most amplifiers that have two inputs, they'll use two 68Ks that are in parallel with each other, right? And the way that works is when you put the input into input 1, it drops this number down to 33K because it puts these puts the two 68K grid stoppers in parallel with each other, which then means that it drops their resistance in half. So 33K is a magic number, but you can still do a single one like this at 68 if you want it to be a little bit darker, and if you want it to be a little bit brighter, you can go down to 10K. That's up to you, but that's what its job is to keep RF out of the tube, to keep it from being modulated and amplified. That's it. Its secondary job, or secondary function, is to stop grid stopping. It's to stop blocking distortion. On the input side, that's not going to generally be a problem unless you're using, pedals that produce like 30 dB of gain or something like that. But that's an intermediate stage thing. For the input side, it's not for blocking distortion. Once you get past the input side of things, that's where it's used for, is for blocking distortion and a little bit of tone control. All right, let's talk a little bit about the tube itself. 99% of guitars, or guitar amplifiers, use a triode tube. That's your 12A blank 7 family. So you got your 12A U7, 12A T7, 12A Y7, 12A X7, right? That's that whole family. There's obviously different versions out there. You got your 6SL7s or whatever, or 6S7Ls or whatever the hell they are. Same. It's still a triode in there. Most all of them are triodes. An EF86 is a different story. That is a pentode. That is a different story, though. We're not going to talk about that now. So, triode. The reason it's triode is because it has three main components in order to make it work. The cathode, this little L-shaped thing down here, the grid, which is what actually modulates the electron flow through the tube, and the anode, which is what the electrons smash into to create amplification. So electrons flow from the cathode, the negative side of the DC element of the tube or amplifier circuit, to the anode, which is the positive side, or HT plus side of the DC element of a tube amplifier. So the electrons flow in that direction, and they are modulated with the signal that flows on the grid. The signal that flows on the grid is an AC signal. So the signal that comes from your guitar is an AC signal. Most all pedals. Most all pedals have batteries in them, right? Which is why almost all, and I'm gonna say all of them, have an output capacitor on them. You'll notice that in pedal designs, they put a capacitor on the output of the tube. I did it again. Pedal. They put that there to keep the DC element of the pedal, I'm going to say it right that time, pedal, from getting into the grid of the preceding, whatever's in, next in line, right? So we do not want DC to get on the grid of any tube in an amplifier, which is what this guy does here, but we're going to get into that in a minute. So the cathode and the anode have a cathode resistor and a plate resistor, or anode resistor, if you will. That's ubiquitous to all of them. They all have to have something like that. What do those do? Those kind of set the floor, the ceiling, and then where they kind of work in a range, right? So you're kind of setting the ceiling with one, or the floor with one, the ceiling with the other, and then between the two of them, you kind of have this window that it makes this tube kind of operate within. Some of that comes down to the voltage on the tube, of course, too. So without going into load lines, all you need to know is that these numbers that you see right here are like the magic go-to numbers. This will produce a center biased, just nominal guitar amp stage, like preamp stage, if you will. You use this with that value of power on it, it's going to be straight up the middle. It's like a blank slate, if you will. Now, you can adjust things a little bit. With the plate resistor, you can kind of think of that as a way to get more gain or less gain, right? Generally, you don't go below 100K. Generally. It's not that you can't, you just generally don't. But you generally, I'm going to say that a lot. Take a shot every time I say generally. You will oftentimes see amplifiers have 100K there, 200K, and 220K. Now, the reason why you would go higher there is to get a little more gain going out of the tube. Keep in mind, electrons are flowing this direction. They're coming into contact with that plate resistor. We got a voltage divider in there now because we're going off this way here to the next stage, right? So the larger that value is, the more it's going to want to just divert that way. So it's going to want to divert out of the tube to the preceding stage. Whereas the lower that is, the more it's just going to want to go to HT, right? It's just going to flow through the tube and do nothing in terms of amplification. There's a limit to how far you can go with that, though. All right, so we know now that if we go with a higher value, we're going to get a little more gain coming out of the tube. But there's a trade-off. It does feel and it does sound a little bit different. Generally, take another shot. When you go with a higher value, it makes the tube a little more, what's the word for it? Compressed. It's got like a tighter, more staccato-like feel to it. It's not as bubbly, right? It can brighten it up just a little bit, not much, a little bit. And it will obviously increase the output. And when I say output, it's not like a significant amount, but it is a noticeable amount. So it increases the gain of the tube a little bit. Conversely, we can go down here to the cathode resistor and do kind of a similar thing. So the lower the value, we've talked in other episodes about the cold clipper in, say, like a JCM 800, right? The lower the value, the more you're trying to get it to prematurely distort on the negative swinging signal, right? So as the signal comes into the grid, when it swings down or negative towards negative, it prematurely starts to cut off and clip. So that's what you're trying to do when you go with higher values. A center biased tube is pretty much this here, like I've talking about, 1K8 to 1K5 and a 100K with about 250 volts on it. Okay? So if you go higher in value, say 2.2K or whatever, maybe 300 or 3.3K or something like that, you're going to quiet down that tube a little bit. It's not going to have as much swing and voltage out of it, right? But it will be prone to clipping prematurely on the negative going signal of what goes into it. Now, on the input side of an input portion of an amplifier, if this is the first tube in an amp, not as much of an issue. Preceding stage, big issue. And that's not to say that it's an actual issue, but it's just that value right there will make a huge difference. Now, in the first stage, it's just going to make that tube a little bit quieter, a little bit more anemic, if you will. Whereas if you go the other way, you go lower in value, it'll make the tube a little bit bolder, bigger, warmer, girthier, right? And the reason it is that is because it's got more volume. You've got more energy going that way. Why is that? Again, electrons want to flow from ground or zero towards the HT or the plate. So the higher that is, the more resistance it's got. So it's not going to flow as much, right? Whereas if you go with a lower value cathode resistor, you get a little more free flow of electrons. Now that goes the other way though. It means that this stage will start to distort going kind of the other way. A triode stage, 12AX7 tube, right? A single stage in a triode, generally does not distort symmetrically. It's almost always going to be asymmetrical distortion. It will almost always, I'm not going to say almost always, it will always distort on the negative swing of the incoming signal first. It will always distort in the negative going signal swing first. That's not to say that it won't distort on the positive going side, but it's always going to distort on the negative swing of that signal first. So, that being said, going with something like 820 ohms here will get a little bit more gain, and it will warm it up a little bit. It will embolden that tube stage a bit. All right, now let's talk about this guy here, the bypass capacitor. The bypass capacitor is there to help this stage amplify even still a little bit more. So that's why you can get away with a lower value here. These still do work in tandem. So if you use a 1K8, you're still kind of limited to the amount of gain that you will acquire with that amount of cathode resistance. But you can still get more gain if you fully bypass it. Now, when I say fully bypassed, I pretty much mean using a value 10 UF or above. So if you use a 10 UF bypass capacitor, you've pretty much got full bandwidth, passage of frequency amplification through this tube. 25 UF, most certainly you have full bandwidth. As you go lower in value, so let's go to the far extreme, let's say 1 UF, right? That's probably as low as you typically would go. JCM uses a 0.68, so close enough to being 1. You imagine your frequency range, right? So this is your frequency range. 10 UF is all of it. Everything's going out 100%, right? As you go lower in value, you take more and more of the lows and you leave only the highs. So with a 1 UF, you've taken all the lows and most of the mids, and they're nominal. They're not going to be amplified to any degree. But everything above, X number of whatever the corner frequency that those two create, we're just going to say upper mids and highs. That will be amplified to full potential through this tube. That's what that is doing. So the lower that value, the more high frequency amplification you will have. The lower the higher the value, 10 UF to 25 UF, the more overall gain you will get just altogether. It kind of is a generational thing. So let's say 25 UF is as big as you need it to be. Going down to 10 UF, you might not notice that much. Maybe you'll notice the lowest of lows just aren't as woofy or woolly as they were before. But you'd have to go down to about 5 UF before you really start to notice any major change in the tonality of the amplification of that stage. And then from 5, you would have to go down to 2 or 2.5 UF to kind of really hear the next major change in amplification. And then again down to 1 UF after that. I'd say 1 UF is like the magic number in terms of how low you can go. 0.68, obviously that's what Marshall uses. That is great. You can use that value too. But once you get down to about 1 UF, it's pretty much as low a value as you need to go. But I digress. So we got that. Let's talk about the voltage a little bit. So there's a range of voltage that you can use on the tube, and it does have an effect on how it sounds and how it feels. Generally, take another shot. The higher the voltage, again, you start getting into that brighter, generally a more staccato kind of feel. It's, got a little more snap to it, right? It kind of can go that way. Too much of a good thing is still too much. It'll give you the most amount of voltage gain with the highest amount of headroom that you can have, but it will also make it a little bit brighter. Okay, so it'll make that stage brighter and just more abrupt. But it will be less prone to breaking up, which could be a bad thing because you might want it to break up sooner. On the, first gain stage, the very first tube in your amp, maybe not as big a deal, but the preceding ones, it might be a huge deal. Whereas going lower in value will, and when I say value, I mean lower in voltage, it can make the stage a little too murky, a little too round, if you will, because it does take some of the highs out. And it might get a little too loose feeling. It might just feel a little sloppy, murky, and just maybe not quite what you're looking for. And then, of course, it may also not amplify enough to really push the next stage where you want it to go. So you can play with the dropping resistors that, control the voltage to these stages to kind of get to this range where it's the right amount of feel and gain, or vice versa. Let's say it's, a little too sharp, a little too snappy, or maybe a little too bright. You can lower that voltage a little bit, and that will help murk it up a little bit. It'll a little darker, a little more bubbly. You can do that. And then finally, we've got the 22 NF, which is 0.022 UF, coupling capacitor. Now, the coupling capacitor keeps the DC off of the preceding stage's grid. We talked about that with pedals earlier when I kept saying tube stage, but you know what I mean. So when the tube operates, it still has a DC element that flows out with it, and it's commingled with the AC, that it's amplifying of the input of that tube. So at this point right there, if I can not fooge everything up. So at this point right here, we're looking at this half of the tube stage now, right? There's a DC and an AC element that are commingled together. With this coupling capacitor, it removes the DC aspect of anything that's going on in this tube stage and only allows the high voltage, high, amplification factor AC signal to pass through. So a cathode, my goodness, a coupling capacitor, a capacitor in general is AC blind. That means it doesn't care about it whatsoever. It just lets it do whatever it wants to do. It will block DC though. So it does not allow DC to pass. If you take a capacitor and you put it over the top of your battery, it won't spark, it won't do anything. It'll just charge up to whatever the voltage of the battery is. But none of the two sides are actually doing anything. It's just storing a charge inside of that capacitor. And then when you take it off, that capacitor now holds that stored energy that it was taking from the battery. And then you go and you touch both sides of the leads and you get a little shock, right? That's how it kind of works in here too. But it's able to release that energy, but that's beside the point. Where it doesn't really matter. All you need to know is that a capacitor blocks DC, but lets AC flow through it. All right. So we talked in the last episode that a capacitor with a resistor to ground, and we're talking about this guy here on the next stage, that is the grid leak resistor, those create a high pass filter, or a low cut filter, if you will. The higher the value of this capacitor, the more bass you have. Okay, so that means the lower this value, so 0.0047 or 500 PF, for instance, the less bass you would have. Now, remember, we talked about it going the opposite direction. So if you were to have a resistor here first and then this capacitor going to ground, that would create a low pass or a high cut filter. Creates a single pole filter, if you will. But in that other orientation where it's resistor first and then capacitor to ground, you will cut the highs. again, the larger the resistor, the more highs you would cut. The lower the resistor, the less highs you would cut. So in this instance here, you must always have a coupling capacitor. There must always be something like that there. What value to go with? 0.022. If you don't know what value you want to go with, start with that one. 0.022 or 22 NF, depending on which side of the pond you're on, is like the end-all be-all of starting points if you're not sure where you're going to end up being at. So I would say that with this circuit right here being like the quintessential universal gain stage, if you will, these values here are probably going to be just spot on, right? Maybe a little too bassy, I think. But I think if you were to get rid of this 10 UF altogether, that would be like the perfect value. If you go with a 25 UF in that spot, 0.022 or 22 NF would be too big. I think you're going to want to go to a 0.01 at that point. But I digress. So you start with a 0.022 if you don't know what value you really want to go with. If it's too bassy, you go smaller, 0.01 or 0.015, or you go down to 0.0047 or something like that, right? If it's not bassy enough, you go up. You can go 0.033 or you can go 0.047. Those are kind of the standard up and down variances that you can go with. That's really all you need to think about with that. Obviously, with the grid leak, we've kind of made it full circle at this point now. You can use that as a volume control for the preceding stage. We already mentioned that. This is basically like a volume control. But you do have a gain pot still. I suggest, this is a me thing, you don't have to if you don't want to. It is wise in most stages to always have some amount of grid leak resistance, regardless of whether or not you have an actual volume control or not. If that pot does go open, which is entirely possible to have happen, you lose that grid reference, which means that this tube is no longer able to manage its own bias, which means it can go into thermal runaway if you were to take that out. If you took that out, this tube would not be happy with you. So it's definitely good practice to always have some amount of grid leak resistance, whether it be 1 meg and then you put, whatever, value gain pot that you want in there. You don't have to though. I'm just saying it's probably good practice. You'll see a lot of amps that do it anyway. And it's kind of silly. Some people will say, well, it's stupid because if you put a 1 meg grid leak with a 1 meg pot, you essentially have 500K worth of grid leak resistance. So why not just go with a 400 or 500K pot, right? Well, when you have that, you always have at least 500K worth of grid leak resistance, which means this tube will never go into thermal runaway. That's all there is to it. That might be why they are doing it. It might just be that they don't want to have a 1 meg pot because it could be noisier. Or it just could be that they wanted 500K and they just didn't want to use a 1 meg pot. I don't know, whatever it could be. So let's do a quick recap here. We got like 2 minutes to stick it underneath the 30-minute mark. Grid stopper. On the input side, it keeps RF modulation off of the tube or out of the tube and keeps it from being amplified and out of the tube. Okay? 68K is a great starting value, probably going to be a little dark and murky, but whatever. 33K is kind of the magic number. You can go down to as low as 10K. 10K is going to be brighter, but might allow modulation still of radio frequencies to get amplified out of that tube. So, in other spots in the amplifier, we're not going to talk about it, but blocking distortion is what its primary purpose is later on in the amp. Anywhere from 100K up to about 470K is what it will do, or are the values that you can use for blocking distortion. Obviously, higher values will lower the high frequency content of that gets into the tube. So it works kind of two things at once. It does a little bit of tone shaping while also keeping the tube out of blocking distortion. There you have it. We just talked about the grid leak. Again, these guys here, you do not have to have this bypass capacitor. although it does increase the gain of the stage. So if you need it to have a little more snap in the front end, you can add that. It's a generational kind of thing, so if you want full frequency response, you're probably going to have to go 10 to 25 UF. If you don't want quite all the lows, you're going to have to go down to about 5 UF or 3 UF before you start really noticing any loss of low-end content. That is something you're going to have to play with. As far as values here, again, going lower in value will increase the voltage gain of that tube a little bit. It will have a little more roundness to it, but it'll also have a propensity to distort a little bit sooner, especially in later gain stages. In the very first stage, you're kind of playing the balancing point. How much gain do you really want versus, the noise that you get from what you're doing with things. Up here, plate resistor, 100K, pretty much the ubiquitous number to go with. You can't go wrong with 100K. If you want a little more gain, you can go 200 or 220. Again, going higher in value will change the feel and a little bit of the sound of the amp. It doesn't change the sound as much as it changes the feel, though, I think. The voltage, you can change the voltage. That will kind of vary the feel, again, of that stage. More voltage, generally a little more sterile, staccato, not sterile, but definitely sharper, more attack, more gain, more headroom, and brighter feeling, or brighter sounding. Lower voltage will murk it up a little bit, darker, a little more spongy, looser, and more bubbly perhaps. And then, of course, the coupling capacitor. Coupling capacitor, start with 0.022 UF, go up or down depending on how much bass you want or need. Again, larger value means more bass, so 0.022, you would then go to 0.033 or 0.047 if you wanted more bass. If you needed less bass, you can go down. So next logical step down would be 0.015, 0.01, or 0.0047, something like that. That kind of progression downwards. The tube itself has a triode, or the tube itself is a triode in 99.99% of all guitar amplifiers. And that triode consists of three main parts: the cathode, the grid, and the anode/plate. Okay, that's kind of how they work. The signal comes in on the grid, and it modulates the voltage that flows from the cathode. It flows from the cathode, the negative or 0 volt supply, towards the anode/plate. And that's what creates the amplification out of the plate of the tube. Okay, so that's how this works. I hope that answers some questions. With that bit of data there, and not having to do any math, and not having to use any, tube charts or, load lines and all that crap, without having to do all that kind of stuff, you can kind of get an idea of how this stage works in all the preceding stages as well. And then you can kind of know what you need to play with what in order to make them string together. So obviously, if you took this stage and you copied another one just like it right behind it, it would probably be uncontrollable, because 1 meg has a lot of volume and it will smash the ever-living crap out of that next gain stage, right? So you might need to lower that value. Maybe on the next stage, you go with a 220K up there and then a 2.2K or something. Or maybe you go something like a JCM 800. You put a 10K there and a 100K on the top. And that's what allows you to get kind of that, more JCM 800 kind of asymmetric distortion thing that it's got going on. Whatever it is. So that's how you can play with that. That's what those little parts do. I hope this helps. I hope this answers all of your questions. And stick around. We got more. We'll get into some more technical stuff perhaps later, but that ties together everything we were talking about with the resistors and capacitors, and then how they interact together to make this stage do what it needs to do. We'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.